end of the day, on Twitter and Facebook, news is still being consumed by the majority of those users from mainstream papers. They're linking back to the New York Times, back to the Globe and Mail, back to CBC. That's where the majority of people are getting their news. And most people still continue to get their news from television. The revolution hasn't quite taken over yet for those 30 and up, right? So, I feel like if things are going to change in terms of the representation of Aboriginal people in the news, we still need to play in the big sandbox. We can't just go and say, we're going to play in our little corner here. And that's where I'd like to see some things change. And frankly, amongst First Nations people, CBC just did a very large audience survey of about 1,200 Aboriginal consumers, just media consumers. And what we found was that Aboriginal folks, both on and off reserve, are using TV far above average than the rest of Canada, using radio at above average, a little bit above average than the rest of Canada, using internet a little bit less than average than the average Canadian. But the number one thing that they're watching on TV and consuming on radio and online is not drama, it's not sports. Those two things surprised me. It's news. They're consuming news. That's the number one thing that they're consuming. Not just on CBC, like across all networks. They're going to news. That's like the rest of Canada. First Nations folks want to know what's going on in their community. They want to know if there's a fire. They want to know if there's someone prowling around their neighborhood, breaking into things. They want news. They want good news. They also told us that they're kind of tired of seeing the 4Ds. They're kind of tired of seeing stereotypical negative portrayals of Aboriginal people. So, what are we going to do about that? We, as the mainstream media. That's what the question I ask, is what is the mainstream media going to do to change the portrayal that we've been giving the rest of Canada about Aboriginal people? I recently handed out a survey to some journalism students at UBC. I called it a First Impressions worksheet. And one of the questions that I asked was, and this was a fill-in-the-blank questionnaire, one of the questions I asked was, sometimes I feel blank when preparing to interview a person who is of Indigenous descent. Sometimes I feel blank when preparing to interview a person of Indigenous descent. And there were other questions on the survey, but I was kind of struck by this one because here are some of the answers that they gave. Unsure, uneducated, nervous, naive, anxious, and self-conscious. One person said happy. So what, and this may be because they're students, but I'm willing to bet, and I just gave this sheet out, so I haven't really tested it with mainstream news reporters, but I'm willing to bet that a lot of the reporters in the CBC newsroom over there would answer roughly the same way. So what is happening when we're sending reporters out to First Nation communities to do stories? They're going out and they are anxious and uneducated and nervous and naive and self-conscious. That's not a great recipe for a news story at 9 o'clock in the morning when you've got reporters that feel that way. So I think we can change that. And I'm going to briefly tell you about two things that I'm doing to hopefully get some answers that are people feeling educated and feeling not naive, not unsure of themselves. At UBC this year, I'm very pleased that we're launching a course called Reporting in Indigenous Communities. It starts in January. We have 16 students signed up. Thanks for, incredibly to the work of our former director, Marilyn Young. I'll be teaching that class. Marilyn's in the back there. And there were two goals when we set up the class. If we wanted students to have an experiential learning experience. And that's partly because of my Aboriginal heritage. That's the way we taught our children experientially. But mostly because as journalists, students need to get out there, get their hands dirty, right? Book learning isn't gonna, it's gonna give them some knowledge, but to really understand how to report in Aboriginal communities, how to do a better job, they need to get their hands dirty. And secondly, to set up the course, we needed to have First Nations input and support. That was key to me. That has been a balancing act, because on the one hand, we wanted to have Lower Mainland First Nation communities who supported the course. On the other hand, journalistic independence is critical to the program, to us as journalists. And so I wasn't sure how the First Nations that we approached were going to react when we said, I'd like to send a bunch of students into your communities to do some reporting, and by the way, we have final editorial say. I wasn't sure about that, because First Nation communities have a long history of folks coming into their communities saying, we're here to help, and we'd like to tell your story, and then leaving and never sharing any of that information or asking how, showing how it was going to be used, and maybe not even, the First Nation communities not even seeing it. So I wasn't sure what the First Nations were going to, how they were going to react when I said we need to maintain journalistic independence. Well, I'm pleased to say that the First Nations have responded incredibly well. We have 5 communities here in the Lower Mainland, Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Tawasin First Nation, Stalo Tribal Council, and the Urban Indigenous, Urban Aboriginal community, who are all on board with the course, and we're hoping for a couple more. Because they understand that it's important that students get introduced at an early stage to these important issues, so that they're not unsure and anxious and uneducated when they get into the pressure-packed newsroom. And so I'm looking forward to the work that they're, and the First Nations are very much participating in the course. They're going to be supplying expertise, they're going to be giving us tours of their First Nations and all kinds of things. So I'm looking forward to the work that the students are going to produce and what we're going to learn. And I'm looking forward to sharing that experience with the First Nation communities. The second thing is, unfortunately, that's only 16 students at UBC. And it's only for 3.5 months that we're going to be spending that time talking about these things. So I've also put together an online guide which is sharing a lot of these lessons, talking about the 4 Ds, and talking about ways that journalists can adapt. Because there is a clash of cultures going on here. The newsroom culture and Aboriginal cultures are very much clashing at times. Over time, things like time. Deadlines are not Indian time. Vice versa, Indian time are not newsroom deadlines, and that's a real clash of cultures. But there are ways that journalists can adapt newsroom culture so that it better understands and appreciates Aboriginal cultures. And the stories will only get better if newsrooms understand things like Indian time, if they understand protocols about what to film and what not to film when it comes to ceremonies, if they understand that we are story takers. That's what media are. We go into communities, we ask for their story, we take them away, and we don't give much back. And Aboriginal communities have a long, long, long history of story takers. And so it's a little bit understandable that First Nation folks are a bit hesitant and distrustful when a reporter gives them a call on a cell phone. But there are ways to work around that, and some of the answers to that are in the online guide. I wish I could give you the URL, but we're just finishing it off. But if you follow me on Twitter, @DuncanMcHugh, I'll be announcing the URL in about 2 weeks' time. So I'm going to wrap up, but the bottom line for me is that it's important that First Nations voices, First Nations perspectives are represented in the mainstream media. They're not necessarily being fully represented right now. But I think that education is a tool to change that. And I think that journalists are hungry. The journalists that I know, they're hungry to try to figure out how to change these things. They understand, they recognize. I don't, you know, I talk with my editor about the drumming. Let's not start with the drumming today. And he gets it, he understands, right? They just haven't necessarily been exposed to that. So I think they're hungry for education. And I think that if journalists are offered the opportunity to learn about First Nation culture and to learn about First Nations customs and protocols and how to fit that into their newsroom practice in practical ways, then I think our audiences are going to be the ones that benefit. Thank you.
Next up, we have Don Bain, who is the Executive Director of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, which is a non-profit political advocacy organization dedicated to support the recognition of Aboriginal rights and respect for Aboriginal cultures worldwide. He is from the Lheidli T'enneh. Lheidli T'enneh, thank you, community outside of Prince George, and he has graduated from UBC with a degree in Anthropology. Don Bain.
Hi, I just prefer sitting down, so Adi, Musi Cho for Kanarji for introducing me to you. First of all, I acknowledge the Coast Salish territory, to which we have the privilege of meeting on today. Hi, my name's Don. I've been tweeting throughout this session. You know, follow our feed, UBCIC, at UBCIC. I guess I'm coming in from the other side. We are a non-profit organization, the Union of BC Chiefs. We are an organization that was founded in 1969 by the chiefs across the province who came to Kamloops for a 3-day conference in the October of 1969, primarily to fight against the federal, there was a federal initiative, which is commonly referred to as the White Paper, Pierre Trudeau, and it proposed essentially an overnight solution. Let's just write out the Indian Act. By doing that, there would be no Indian problem because there's no Indians. But it was our forefathers, it was our great aunties, our uncles, our grandparents that fundraised, that raised and fed the people to come and meet and to form a strategy to unite to fight against the White Paper. So that's how the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was born. And I guess the way I can maybe describe how we approach social media is quite simple. As Ganarji mentioned, my background is anthropology. I worked in museums. I worked at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. I also worked at the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. And one of the things they teach you, when you're working in museums, is that it's about the streakers, the strollers, and the readers. And it's a simple analogy. When you're at the museum, you see the tour buses come pulling up, and you have these tourists that are from the cruise ship, and they streak through the museum. They streak through, they look, take pictures, hey, stand there, go into the gift shop, grab the postcard, and they'll leave. But in that moment, they're at least trying to, they opted to go on this excursion, they've opted to take the time to go to the museum, to at least look at the polls, maybe read a few of the placards, and if they're lucky and if they've organized well, they met tour guides such as myself. I used to be a tour guide. And I took that time to try to educate them as best as I can in a way that was for them easy to understand. The next one is strollers. Strollers are essentially an audience of people that come from your local area, so Metro Vancouver, British Columbia. Strollers are people that come to the museum that they take the time. They bring their friends from out of town, saying, hey, you should go to the Museum of Anthropology, blah 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 blah. Let's all go. They show up with their strollers, and their kids, and take the time to go through. The last ones are readers. Readers are very important to museums because they are the ones that will take out membership. They're the ones that will contribute. They're the ones that will donate. They live local. They're in the Vancouver area and Greater Vancouver area, for example, for the Museum of Anthropology. And they are the ones that are willing to take the time to volunteer. It's not much different from what we do at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Our struggle, and unfortunately, it is true. The 4 Ds is very true. And the elder that told you that is very wise, I think, because as Indian people, we like to make things simple. And it's kind of like a tinge of humor, whether it's gallows humor or black humor, if you want. But it's identifiable. And it's intensely personal. Because when the media do show up on the reserve or they phone you, is at your lowest, is at your point of sorrow, is at the point where the family are asking questions. We do have a history. Our history is fraught with horrible truths. I mean, it's our parents went through residential schools. Our grandparents, their uncles and aunties. We live with that. We, as Indigenous peoples, go to far too many funerals for our cousins. It's just the reality of it. It is not the whole reality, of course not. But certainly, what we celebrate is that we're still here. We still know who we are. And I think that's how we look at it from the union's perspective, if I maybe just circle back to that. Let me just use an example. I'm wearing a t-shirt today. Salmon is a vital component, vital part of who we are and as Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. We've been saying it for decades, years. It's a large part why Mr. Sparrow put his net in the Fraser River in the early 80s. And DFO came along, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, said, you can't fish here. He says, yes, I can. I'm Musqueam, and I can fish here. It's my Aboriginal right. No, you can't. Next thing you know, he's in jail. They seized his boat, they seized his net, they seized his fish, and we have a court case. It's true, and I find it resonates with me strongly what Candice is doing with media. But it's also true that we've used a different language starting in the 70s. And it's a language of law. It's a language of constitutional law. It is a language that we can convey, whether you're in a courtroom, whether you're in a boardroom, whether you're in a classroom, that people can understand what we're trying to say. It's a worldview. And that message is still here. So let me illustrate this message with my t-shirt. So we've been saying this, since Mr. Sparrow was arrested, that we've had an Aboriginal right to fish. After a number of court cases, a number of appeals, Supreme Court Canada actually confirmed it. Said, hey, you know what? You do have an Aboriginal right to fish, but that also could possibly include other things. So I won't bore you with I won't have time to tell you the history of it. But essentially what that boiled down to was opened up the door and provide meaning to what we call Section 35 of the Constitutional, of the Constitution of Canada. Section 35 sometimes is referred to as a box, and there's some debate in the Indian country whether that box is full of rights or perhaps it's just an empty box. Is the premise that is based in large part on the concept of Western common law, but certainly it is something that you see. Let me just gather my thoughts for a second. How do you explain that? Is really what the challenge is. And we've become quite adept since starting in the 70s, starting with different court decisions like Calder, to use the law, legal language, if you will. So we talk about it as a constitutional right. We talk about it as a fiduciary duty of the Crown. We talk about the honor of the Crown. We talk about consultation and accommodation of our rights. We talk about strength of claim. But ultimately, it's still the same message. What Mr. Sparrow did was to talk about the right to fish, and he based that on who we are. He based that on where he came from. He based it on millennium of occupation. He based it because he was Musqueam. The media, the language of law, whether we use Twitter or Facebook or we watch the CBC National, what we're really saying in a lot of ways is that we're still here. I'm Lheidli T'enneh. What that means to me is I am tied to an area, what we know as just outside Prince George, including Prince George, by my ancestors. It is my great-great-uncles, my great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandmother. It's been like that since time immemorial. The trick about that is trying to produce an approach, and I've been thinking about this a little bit over the last couple of days, of what will appeal to the streakers, what will appeal to the strollers, and what will appeal to the readers. And if you go to our website, it's a simple design. On the right-hand side, for example, you have essentially the headline of our press releases. Straight to the point, boom. If you look at our press release, you'll see that essentially the main point is in the first paragraph. It's journalism 101. You just want to get that snappy quote out. That may appeal to the strollers. They read through the press release and they start looking around and maybe look at it related press releases about salmon on our website. But the trick is to turn them into readers. And the readers are the ones that'll take the time and actually download. We have PDF copies of our fisheries papers on our website and read more about it. It's not a hard sell, of course, to talk to our youth about that. They have a strong sense of who they are. It's just encouraging them to go beyond that. To encourage them to say, well, I'm Aboriginal. Well, yes, you are Aboriginal, but you're from a place. You're from a nation. You're from a community. Well, yes, I'm Lheidli T'enneh. Well, what does it mean to be Lheidli T'enneh? And that's kind of one of our challenges, with our families and the people we talk to on our website. We do have, for example, an email link where we get people appealing to the union to intercede on their behalf, whether it's about child welfare, troubles with the BAIN Council, but we can't. We're just not structured to assist that way. But we also get a lot of questions from grade 4, students, grade 7. We get, you can tell we're Haida is it still a mainstay of school curriculum in this province. We get kids, you know, in high school, and most certainly we get a lot of masters and PhDs emailing us. And we're willing to help. We're willing to assist in any which way, because in the end, it's still about that next process for us. It's trying to communicate and educate. You know, we're not scary, you know, whether you're a journalist or not. We're just people. We're strong people, I would say. But you need to get to know us. You know, I am humbled to be with the panel here, because I'm learning as much as you about this different perspectives, and I am pretty excited to see how this online course works and to read more about your work on Facebook. I know